everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Elena. So tonight we are excited to have Katy Kramer joining us. I've heard you all talking with her and talking to each other before we started this evening. So Katy is an author. She has written newspaper articles, and she's written for university publications, and she has spent more than a decade doing research on her new book, which is the Portsmouth Naval Prison. So she is here this evening to tell us all about this structure that I'm sure we're all very familiar with, and we're excited to hear all about it. So please welcome Katy Kramer.
Hello, welcome. It's really nice to be here. What I really like is, you probably know that I teach college students, and so it's a treat to find adults, because you've stowed your cell phones, you're not eating the last meal that you missed, and you don't have provocative words on your clothing. So I know it's going to be a good night. I want to tell you just briefly about this picture. It took me a really long time, as he said, about a decade. Maybe if I knew what I was doing, it would have been less. But all of this information was just all over the place, and I really had to dig it out. And it was kind of like a treasure hunt. And I'd find something, and I'd go there, and then I'd find something else, and I'd go there. And one day I got a picture from the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. And I think it was actually that picture. So I called the archivist at the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C., and I said to him, I have a picture of the prison, and they're really hard to find. Do you have any more? Funny you should mention that, he said. We're digitizing the whole collection, and we just pulled out the Portsmouth Naval collection. It's big, it's old, it's falling apart, nobody ever comes down to see it, and we were going to throw it out. I said, do not do that. So I had to go down. I went down, I flew down, and I stayed there about 2 days. They were just delighted. And I scanned the entire collection. Wonderful. So, yeah, they're not going to throw it out now, and now I have it. And I put them in the acknowledgments in the book so that they would not throw it out. Most people want to know how I got started on this odyssey. I used to live on the seacoast for about 10 years, and I knew the prison was there. But I had only seen the annex from where I was looking, and I always thought it was a storehouse or a warehouse, and I didn't really know that it was the prison until one day. You probably know where this is. This is the road leading into Newcastle. And I was riding down with a friend, and we're riding down this road, and of course we go by the prison, and I was going that way, and what comes up on the side is the prison. It comes right up, as you know. And I turned to him and I said, "What's that?" And of course, he looked at me like I had 9 heads, but he didn't say what I knew he wanted to say. He said, "That's the Portsmouth Naval Prison. It's the worst of the worst." And he had been an Army guy, so I guess he knew what he was talking about. But he also told me about the World War II submarines that had surrendered here. I had just come out of journalism school, and I did my master's thesis on, he was the only person to write about the atomic bomb, and he was the New York Times science writer. So I was steeped in World War II, and this really got me going. And so I thought, if I don't know about this, I bet a bunch of other people don't know about it, and I bet there's a story here. Well, there is, but it took me a while. And since I was a rank beginner, I started from the absolute bitter beginning, and I went back to find out why you had to have a prison in the first place. Why didn't you just send them to Leavenworth, which is what they do when prison closed, but why did you have to have a naval prison? And I went back and I found out that during the Punic Wars, which was like 200 BC, something like that, they were using these boats, and they're triremes because they're 3 and 4 decks. And what came out of this was an oral tradition, just to keep everybody doing what they were supposed to be doing. And they used them in battle fairly successfully to expand their empire. But there was a long tradition. I'm sure there was a long tradition. Whenever anybody got in a boat, somebody made a rule. But there was a long tradition, an oral tradition. And the British, as we all know, who rule the waves, codified it. So they were the first one really to put it into writing. And we, smartly, people that we were, took it for our own, and we called it Rocks and Shoals. And it was pretty much, and it has been more or less what we've been using ever since. And Constitution talks to us about what the system is for people who were in the military and different from ordinary people like myself. For a long time, physical punishment was the means of keeping everybody in line. And it was pretty good for the people on the ships because, in part, they didn't have a lot of room. They needed all hands on deck. There was no place to put them, like in a prison or a jail. And so physical punishment seemed to work for quite a long time. And then the people on the land were starting to think that this was maybe barbaric, and in fact, probably they were right. And the Army banned it first. And it took the Navy a while, for obvious reasons. But they finally did, and quieted what was happening on land. But then we created another problem. Oh, don't do that. I'm really good at doing that. Discipline started to deteriorate, so we started to look for an actual prison. I'm going to segue here. You know what this is. This is Portsmouth Harbor. And it's got 7, 8, 9 rivers that feed into it. It has a really bad current.
Second strongest in the world.
Yeah, something like that. This is Portsmouth, and all I wanted, now you all know this, but some other people don't, so I had to put it in the book, which is it's pretty much surrounded by water. And that's an aerial view. Around turn of the century, I think we started building shipyards up and down the East Coast because France and England were taking our ships and our people, and we were tired of that. So we started building shipyards, and obviously the Portsmouth Shipyard was one of them. Here you can see, and why do I know it's 1930? Because right here is the prison, but this is the lower, what we call the Lura Reservation, which is no longer there. And so you can kind of tell, and notice that there aren't a whole lot of bridges. So you can kind of tell. I'm going to make another big segue, and that is to talk to you, and this is when things started to happen, about the Spanish-American War. And you probably all know the Maine sank and Teddy Roosevelt was there. But basically it was the Americans and the Spanish trying to get hold of Cuba. There was a big, and this is important for the beginning of the beginning of the prison. There's a very large battle in Havana Harbor. And we decided, or somebody decided, 3 guys decided, one of whom was named, I always remember, Richmond Pearson Hobson. And he decided to take a collier, a coal ship, and fill it with explosives. So he and his 2 buddies went into Havana Harbor, and they were going to explode this thing and block the harbor so the Spanish ships couldn't get out. They did this, but they didn't quite explode everything that they were going to explode, and they didn't quite get where they were supposed to be, so they're clinging to their boat in the middle of the harbor and thinking that they're dead people, and they hear Spanish voices all around. And it happens to be, who comes and rescues them, Admiral Cervera, who was the admiral in Spain, the Spanish fleet. And he comes down and he takes them, and he takes them up to his castle, to Castle Moro, and he keeps them. So the next day, unfortunately, for the Spaniards, that boat was still blocking everything. So when they came into the harbor, they were kind of like sitting ducks. And we took them all, which is one of the reasons why we got 1,800 prisoners like that and no place to put them. But in the meantime, there was a prisoner swap. And so Hobson and his crew got swapped for somebody else. And when they came back to home territory, they told about the wonderful treatment they had gotten by the Spaniards. And what happened was, and that was picked up by the national newspapers, and that was a huge deal. That was a big story. So when the Spaniards came, and I'll talk to you how the Spaniards got here next. John Long was the he was the Secretary of the Navy, and he was a Mainer. He was from Maine. And he knew about this area. I don't know how he knew, but he knew. And he knew that we didn't have a place for 1,800 people. But they piled them in ships and they were coming up here, and he said, I know just the place. So they all came to where it was. And what happened was this, I don't know why there's a little boy in the front row. I think maybe it's a photographer, so that's all I can think. They got wonderful treatment because of this story. And many people came out to see them. They were the hit of the summer. The women came out. The Red Cross, put them in uniforms. We gave them money, and we took very good care of them for all the time they were there. This is Admiral Surveyor leaving, Surveyor leaving. He stayed in the Rockingham Hotel. And most of the people who were taking care of them were allowed to do so. So it was pretty lax. Probably seen this postcard. This is what was built there for the Spanish-American War prisoners. Now, they said that this was built in 48 hours, but my brother, who edited this, looked at this and he said, you can't build this in 48 hours. I said, well, he says, it has to be 48 days. Well, they're only there for 2.5 months, so either someone's telling a tall tale or I don't know. But anyway, so the Marine Guards came up from the battle and they guarded the prisoners and they stayed there for the next 100 years or whatever. Just want to show you, if any of you are Marines, come on, you can do this. This is Smedley Butler, who is the most decorated Marine ever, and we'll be hearing about him again. He stayed in tents and other places. A number of them died while they were here. They came and picked up their remains about 20 years later, and I think that's still there that says that the Spaniards stayed here, essentially where the prison is now. While we were looking for a prison, things were getting hard because we had a lot of prisoners and no place to put them, so we put them on prison ships. And before the prison was built, there were 2 ships, one of which was the Southery, and they were docked, moored in the back channel until the prison was built. And then they got new roles, and they stayed until the war, and then they were shipped out. So this is one of the first pictures of the prison being built. I always feel sorry for the poor horse. He looks really starving. People ask, this was the cell block, which was built first. And people often, it was actually, one of the things that surprises people, even though this was the worst of the worst, it was pretty innovative for its day. Not all of the innovation was wonderful, but it was pretty innovative. And I'll show you some of the things that they do. The cell blocks were according to the Auburn system, and there are 3 tiers with catwalk. And what's that prison out in California? Yeah, Alcatraz is the same thing. Now you'll notice that there are radiators and windows, neither of which did their job. So part of which the hard time being in the prison was you either froze to death or you sweltered, or unless it was spring or fall. And there are the 3 tiers in the catwalk. The other hardship, the big pipe is what's called a standpipe, and that is for water. And they have horrible water problems. I went down to the Boston Archives and I started to read the reports that the commandants had written, and they all wrote pretty well. But they had horrible water problems for a really long time. They couldn't drink, they couldn't shower, they couldn't shave, they couldn't do anything. And they just piteous. There was always difficulty securing funds, and so they begged, would you please do something? So it was cold, it was uncomfortable, and they didn't have a lot of water. This is the administration building that was built next. And people always ask me why it's built like a castle. Well, there's a couple of different reasons, and you probably all know what these reasons are. But anyway, it was Greek revival. And there are 2 schools of thought. One school of thought was that it would scare you to death. It was imposing, and you walked in, you think, oh, this is our time. They're not fooling around here. And of course, you were not escaping anytime soon. The other one is, what do they call it? Christian virtues of the medieval past. And supposing if you lived in this place, that it will rub off on you and you would become a better person. I'm not sure that's true. Maybe it's kind of old-time feng shui. And I just like this because it looks like there were outhouses in the front. The people who built this were the Bureau of Yards and Docks, and a company by the name of Triest, and who is the other one? Snare, Triest and Snare. And there was a very large company, and they were out of New York. They helped to build the Triborough Bridge. They built the Van Winkle Bridge. They were very successful and very good. And they're the ones responsible for all the curlicues and all of the fancy stuff. After they built the prison, they broke up, and there was Snare and there was Triest. And Triest stayed in New York, and Snare went down to Havana, Cuba, and he got the $1 million contract from the government to refurbish Guantanamo. So he kind of built 2 prisons. The very first commandant was Kelton, and he set everything up. He set up the schedule and who was doing what, and because he was the very first guy. And many of the commandants had gone to training, had gone around and looked at places, brought back good ideas, and were pretty much doing what the forward-looking prison people were doing at the time, and he was one of them. And he retired right after the prison opened. There was no place for the commandant for a while. He was in the administration. There was no place for the guards. They were upstairs in the administration building. Notice that there are guns on the lower right-hand side. That's what they look like. One of the innovations was, it was a Quaker kind of thing, that there was no talking. And this was pretty common. And they thought that if you could think about what you had done, that would somehow change you. What it actually did was drove the men insane, so they stopped doing that after a while. But for quite some time, you couldn't talk at the prison. You had to ask somebody to bring tools. So that's one of the long silent lines. You sat according to your behavior. If you were good, you sat one place or got fed first. If you weren't, you didn't. First escape came here off Workman's Landing. It took them a while to figure out that you couldn't escape by water. So they were always drowning and trying this and that. You couldn't get to the islands, you couldn't do anything. So water was out of the question. But they did figure out how to escape. One of the myths of the prison is that nobody escaped from it. Not true. And then when I was doing research and I came upon this and I was like, whoa, and everybody's looking up at me thinking, what is the matter with her? I was just so surprised. After Kelton left, Leonard came. And he was college educated, and he instituted a lot of different things. He had some weird ideas, though. One of them was that coffee was a problem and beef was a problem. So he reduced the beef rations and he reduced the coffee rations, which of course didn't make him real popular, but I guess he saved people money. But he went on to become a very famous lawyer in Washington, D.C., a military lawyer. And remember old Smedley Butler? Well, he got himself, if you know Smedley Butler, he was always in trouble, but he got himself into trouble because he said something about Mussolini just before the outbreak of the war, and he was court-martialed. And Leonard got him off. Now, we missed the third in here. The third kind of came and went. He had gone around the world, and there's a lot of stuff happening, and they needed him. He was from Vermont, and he was there about 6 months, and they sent him off to some place. But I don't think it was because he did anything bad, which was either you were a really good guy or you were there because you weren't. And what he did, he came from NYU, and he categorized everybody. I thought he was kind of OCD for a while. And I pages and pages of lists, and everybody belongs to this, or they came here for that. This was the religion. This was why they were there in the first place, and he also put in many of the brand new standard Binet tests and personality tests, and really got the intake-outtake thing down pat. That was the schedule, and actually it was better than Kelton's schedule. I had them up like at 3 in the morning if you go in the kitchen. Everything went according to Hoyle. of the way these folks had set it up until Thomas Mott Osborne arrived. Thomas Mott Osborne was from New York, and his middle name, Mott, is from Lucretia Mott, who was in his family. So he comes by his rabble-rousing, honestly, it's genetic, I think. He had been the, what was he? He was the head of prisons in New York State. And he had been, and there was a prison in Auburn. And he was head of the Auburn prison. And the Auburn system was the size of the cell, which was the smallest it could be for somebody to sit and stand. And we changed that. Portsmouth changed it. They made it bigger, but that was the template. And he came over during the Progressive era. And during the Progressive era, during the turn of the century, we were looking at women and education and prisons and alcohol and a whole bunch of stuff and trying to change the world. So he came to Portsmouth Naval Prison with the blessings. One thing he did really well was attract famous and powerful people. He did a couple things not really well as well. And he was famous for becoming one of the prisoners and then coming up and making sweeping recommendations about what they should do in the prison, which he did in Portsmouth. And while he was there, just after he was here, World War I broke out. And he started and there's statistics in a minute, but 400 and ended up with a couple thousand. So he had to start a building project, and he put in what was called the Lura Reservation. He also kicked out all of the Marine Guards and sent them packing, and had the prisoners guard themselves, essentially. So it was kind of a tiered thing. Now, they didn't mete out the punishments, but they suggested what should happen, and pretty much they followed that way. It worked for a while. One of the very good things he did was, well, this is another view of the Lura Reservation, but one of the really good things he did, and I just wanted to show you this, because finally they built a place for the commandant. Took him a while. Never had any money. What he did was send men back to service, which was new and different and very helpful and innovative as it happened. But he got himself into some trouble. He was a concert pianist. He took the prisoners all over the place. They had a wonderful music program. But he tended to circumvent the people at the shipyard, who were none too happy with a lot of these innovations. And they thought that this place was going to heck in a handbasket. And so eventually he was sent packing. He stayed there a long time because his good friend, Franklin Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of Navy. So when he got himself into trouble, all the big guys from Washington came down and bailed him out. And the folks of the shipyard did not like this at all, and perhaps with some good reason. And neither did the guards, who were not employed anymore. And Washington, D.C. was getting wind of what was going on in Portsmouth, and that maybe it wasn't as bad as everybody said it was, and things had to change. So they asked this guy, this is South, to come down and clean things up. Crack down was his marching orders. And in crackdown he did. He brought all the Marines back, sent everybody back into their cells, stopped doing all the good stuff. I was reading the Commandant's report about Thomas Osborne, who was a wonderful writer. And all of a sudden I'm reading, because up until this point, they didn't have anything. They didn't have a lot of anything. But when my Osborne came, the confectioner truck came and delivered like 4 crates of Lorna Doones and Fig Newtons and Necco wafers. And I'm thinking, wow, this is different. And indeed it was. So he really clamped down. One of the things he did was he saved money by having the men take care of their own clothing. If it was ripped or torn or otherwise damaged, they had to repair it and perhaps pay for it. They were none too happy about that. There was a lot of disciplinary problems way in the beginning, and there was something about leg irons, and they were all sent back to their cells. But crackdown he did. He saved the First District a lot of money, and they were really happy with it. He did. Prisoners, not so much. One of the biggest breakouts in the prison happened on his watch. it's a pretty good story. And like all breakouts, it hit the papers for days. And what happened was 4 guys, and I'll show you a picture of it, who were probably working in some repair place, took tin shears and rope and went up to the top of the administration building where they showed movies. And they showed movies Sunday night most of the time. And one of these movies, and they finally figured out that the only time you could escape was in the summer. So this was July, and they knew they couldn't escape during the water. They figured that out as well. So they took these shears, and while everybody was watching this movie, and they got the best movies, so they were very popular, and if you were on good behavior, you got to see more movies. And while everybody was watching this movie, but I couldn't find what it was because no one was paying attention to what they were doing because they had snuck back and cut a hole in the ventilation system, and they had got themselves into the ventilation system up on the roof of the administration building, put their rope down, and got to the bottom before, I guess, the movie was over. And nobody missed them until the movie was over. And they went into a lieutenant's house or quarters, took his suit and his wife's 3 dresses. They dressed as a gentleman and 3 ladies. They took his car, and they drove out the front gates. And they were gone for quite some time and quite a distance. They managed to be in Connecticut when they were finally caught days later in the papers talking about these 4 guys and where they are and what's happening. And if you lived in the area at any time, and I don't know, maybe you've heard of it or knew about it or knew somebody who did, when there was an escape, there's everything that closed in. There was the big horns and the whistles and the dogs and the dragnet. And if you were going to Hampton that day, well, you just didn't because you couldn't. So there was the big dragnet out everywhere. I'm sure that this wasn't the people, but it probably might have been what they were wearing. Yep, I'll go back a minute and finish my story. So they broke in days later into a gas station, and they couldn't pay, so the gas station attendant came out and said, yeah, you have to pay, and they put a gun in his face and said, no, we don't, and took off. He did not chase them, but these guys were tearing through Connecticut. And a policeman who did not know that these people were being sought stopped them, or tried to stop them for speeding. And there's this big chase. And eventually they shot the gas tank, and it exploded, and they got these guys. They put them in the local prison, and they still didn't know, the local jailer still didn't know who these guys were. Finally, they brought them back to Portsmouth, and they brought them back to talk to the commandant. And he said, what were you thinking, essentially? And they said, well, we did pretty well, and probably it was worth a shot. And actually it was. I got a couple things accomplished. One, 4 years later, and I was just reading the paper for research, and I found this guy, one of the 4 years later, escaped for good. So for him, it was a dry run. And the commandant was summarily dismissed. He was back at wherever he was, Nicaragua, like the day later, so they got rid of him. Things pretty much stayed the same until World War II. How are we doing on time? Where is she?
Oh, we still have an hour.
Well, slow down. Well, I'll give you time for questions. This was Colonel Roselle. And he was actually a pretty good guy. He had 2 stints at prison, as you can see. He came in 1930, and it was not as, it was not as important as his second one. His second one, I think they brought him back for, which is for World War II. And it was a good choice, actually. He had gone around, as had many of the other ones, and visited prisons and brigs and all kinds of places, and brought a lot of ideas, both the first time he was commandant and the second time he was commandant. And he really did care a lot about the men. I think there was the history of him that he was going to be a priest, and then he joined the Marines instead. But there was still a lot of do-gooding in him. And so World War II broke out during this time, and many, many men. The number of people waxed and waned, depending really if there was a war. When there was a war, it exploded, and then in between the war times, it wasn't so much. So they built the North Wing. Now, technically, what you heard about the prison was that the cement was going to be the biggest cement structure in the United States or whatever. And had they built it the way it was planned to have been built, that would have been the case. But they always had money problems. So they built the cell block the way it was supposed to be built. But when they finally got around to adding the North Wing, it was smaller and it wasn't a cell block and it did other stuff. And by now, some of your previous commandants had started making the prison self-sufficient. And they did a really good job of that. So there were bakers and washers and menders, and there's always somebody at the prison who could fix something. And they were out and about and doing pretty much, they had people in the kitchen. The fare in the kitchen was really not great for a long time until, I think it was just before I was born, they started planting enormous gardens all over the grounds. And so eating was better, was a lot better when that started to happen. So this is just a picture of I know what I want to tell you. During World War II, they gave many of the prisoners here jobs. They had to do a couple of things. They wanted to get them back fighting, so they were training all manner. I think the Coast Guard was there, everybody was there. They were training people to go back into the service. They were also training them for trades, and there was an enormous education thing going on during World War II. They also got a lot of contracts from the government, and they were working 24 hours a day. They didn't go to sleep. They were building nets and all kinds of things for the war, rubber bumpers. So they were really pretty instrumental in World War II in helping out with the war effort, which I think a lot of people don't know about. And even that was not enough, so they built the annex. And this is the thing that I had been seeing when I was looking at the shipyard, and never thought that was a prison, but of course it was. So the annex got built during the World War II era. And that's another picture of the annex. And that's the completed annex. So what was in the annex? Well, everything got moved around. They had a library, and finally, if you were behaviorally on the list, you could go up and take out books. The New York Public Library donated thousands of books. Apparently they had a really good library. They also had a newspaper that eventually, probably have seen and heard about that. This was the auditorium. It's not obviously the same auditorium that those guys escaped from, but movies were always a big thing. And they got some of the best movies. They got the new movies. So they weren't watching reruns, and they were watching what was coming out, and they saw it before everybody else saw it. And that was one of the motivator to make sure you were on the right side of doing what you were supposed to be doing. This was the infirmary. From the very beginning, there was medical care. There was a dentist, there was everybody. I don't know how good it was, but it was there. And many of the commandants said that the guys who came in back then were malnourished. They were undereducated and malnourished. And they were better off in some respects when they got out than when they came in. But medical was always there. When eventually they built the hospital, as you all know. And I was reading something in the commandant's report, and what started to happen was you could get out of the hospital easier than you could get out of the prison. So they started being sick and going over there and having big fights so that somebody could get injured and go over to the hospital and escape. One guy was in the hospital, and he spent his days sawing the bars off his window and making fake ones. And he did that very well, and he got out. The other thing that the annex allowed was for the squad room. And what that meant was finally, if you were a good actor, you could stay in one of these. And it was no longer as confining as it had been. And so there are many good things that started to happen for people who were there for interesting reasons and not bad reasons. This is the Camp Langdon Band. In 1954, I don't know if any of you, they rehabbed one of the Army bases around Newcastle, Camp Langdon, and that was for men who were about to return to duty. And they brought them up the colors every morning without fail, and the band came up from time to time, maybe every day, I don't know. I just thought this was neat. But what this shows is you can see the administration building and pretty much everything at this point. The annex, the administration building, and both wings. So as you can see, it was a quite different place during war than it was in between the wars. Toward the end of World War II, and this was just like Thomas Mott Osborne kind of got himself, unfortunately, into trouble at the end of his term, so did Rosell. 4 or 5 submarines surrendered in Portsmouth Harbor, and you've probably heard about this. At the end of the war, after Germany had surrendered and Japan had not, a number of submarines were still in the Atlantic, and so they were given a choice of basically surrendering in Newfoundland or in Portsmouth. Some went there, some came here. And 4 or 5 came here. The very last one to come, and they were not treated well. In part because this was the end of the war. These guys, we hadn't, they were sinking our boats, they were killing our men, and the concentration camp information had just come out. So we were not really feeling hospitable when, and understandably so, when the submarines came in. But it was a circus. And security was compromised. Everybody wanted a piece of the action, and their belongings were confiscated, was distributed all over, and a lot of things happened that probably shouldn't have happened. They were, many of them, beaten up in the prison, and some were sent, well, I'll talk to you about Super 234 first. When Germany surrendered and Japan had not, what Germany wanted to do was to take all of its really good technology, and they had a lot of really good technology, and send it to Japan and to get it up and running. So they had a submarine that had done this before, and we bombed it and sank it. So this was their second try. And on this, they had turned a mine layer into a transport ship, and they had put on all of the really good things that Germany had. And there's a Messerschmitt, there was uranium ore, there was a lot of stuff on this, as well as the scientists who could put it together, the airplane specialists, and the manufacturers. So when they got to Japan, they were just going to set themselves up into business. And they could have. But what happened was, Donitz told all of the submarines that if you didn't go into the nearest port, we were going to sink you on sight. So they had this big powwow in the middle of the ocean to decide what they were going to do. And somebody said, well, let's go to Brazil, and somebody said this, but they had a big meeting, and they decided they would surrender in Portsmouth. They didn't want to, but they needed to. We, the government, had been really interested in this submarine because we'd heard that there was all kinds of wonderful stuff on this submarine. So we were watching it. It came in, it did eventually surrender in Portsmouth. The commander of the submarine was not treated well. He ended up going south to Louisiana, Alabama to serve a sentence, and vowed he'd never come back to America, and this was the worst decision he ever made. But not everybody felt that way. Anyway, what happened? So I got to Portsmouth Naval Prison, and we did not know what we had in the beginning, and then all the big guns came down, and they stopped everything. They said, do not touch this submarine. So we took everything on the submarine, including the submarine and all the men on it. And we initiated a program. I think maybe we had initiated this program beforehand. It was called the Paperclip Project. And what we did was, there was a big rush on getting German scientists, by the Russians, by the English, and by us. If you'd seen the Monuments Men, it was kind of like the same thing. They went to get the art, and these guys went to get the scientists and all the lab stuff. So this was a real find, and we kept many of the scientists here. They were the prisoners of peace, they called them, and we used their expertise. One of them was Werner von Braun, who was in the Moon Project, one of the key people who got us to the moon. And of course, when nobody told anybody that these people had been, at Peenemünde and in Germany, and these were, Russian, they were German scientists until we all find out what their background was, and then there was a huge deal. But by then, they were here, and they had done a lot of good stuff. The Russians got a bunch, and England got a bunch. There's this story about how they were all collected around these scientists, and the English were asked the Americans if they would please help them get all the stuff on their truck. And the Americans said sure, so they all pitched in and they loaded up the English truck, and then they threw the English off the truck and they took the truck and all that stuff. And it was competitive. So that's the story of U-234. I actually wrote an article about this. I was taking me so long to write about the prison, I decided I better write something along the way. And I wrote about what was on the submarine, and I traced it up until the first Iraq War to see how we used all this stuff. It was pretty interesting. But one of the things that happened and what got Roselle into trouble was the fact that one of the commanders of one of the submarines was sent to Boston. And he was roughed up there, not treated well at all, and he broke his glasses, slit his wrist, and committed suicide. And that was the straw. A big investigation, and of course Roselle had to resign. And a lot of people were, I don't know, these probably weren't the people, but a lot of people were disciplined. Part of the problem of doing research for the prison is that it changes names so many darn times. I was fine until 1946, and then everything started to change. They did different stuff, different people were there, and it just changed depending on what the government wanted them to do, so it had a lot of different roles and a lot of different names. And until I figured that out, I would come to a dead end in 1945. So this is a picture of everything. This is the chapel. This was officers' quarters and still kind of is. That was the annex, cell block, administration building, the other side. And there's still down the building at the Lura Reservation, that's still there. The guardhouse was moved up, and this is the commandant's house, which is still there. You'll see a picture of that later. This is Camp Langdon. Camp Langdon, as I mentioned, was for those men who were going to go back to service right away. There were no gates or bars anywhere. They could wear half civilian clothes, half military. They didn't have a lot of rules. Coast Guard was there, Army was there, and Navy was there. And eventually they were restored to duty, but it closed because of lack of funds, I think. So again, in the Korean War and the Vietnam War, population goes up. And they had their share of unrest, as did every other prison in the country. And because of the nature of the population, security was increased. And for the first time ever, we'll get to that picture in a minute, this was the guardhouse that they built. There were no, there were no solitary confinement cells built into the prison. Hard to believe, but there wasn't. Eventually they did. They dug it out and they made some in the basement. But they still needed a place to put some of the really bad actors. And they built a house and they called it Little Siberia, and there are stories and stories and stories. When I wrote the book, I had to find somebody who had worked at the prison. And since I'd been going over to the museum for a long time, I got to know Steve, and Steve had been in the prison and head of a lot of things, and he helped me out a lot. And he told me about Little Siberia, a lot of stories. They finally built a fence, which had not been there. And just so you know, you've probably heard the myth that if a prisoner escaped on your watch, you had to serve out his sentence. Not true, says Steve. Speaking of which, I was going through the book with him and we were looking at different pictures and I hadn't decided which would go in. And when all these changes happened, they had to have a lot of training. And so this was a training, he told me. And he is in the middle, in the front row, and he says, "Oh, I'm in this picture." So I figured since he'd helped me a whole lot, I had to put him. From what I could tell, this was really a government thing. But they wanted to close some things, and there was some payback involved. It wasn't totally the shipyard's fault. So it lay actually vacant from 74 to 80. So a lot of damage was done inside in the meantime. This was the picture of the mothballed prison that they put out when they were trying to sell it. Just before the book came out, I went and got pictures, and this was in 215. If you've been there today, it's a little different, but this is what it looked like then. And what I found interesting was that there was vegetation growing up the walls, and if you look at some of the old pictures, they had planted ivy, and there was like a, ivy, it was an ivy league, up and down the walls, and they take it down, and then they replant it, but here it was again. And remember when I showed you the picture and I said that was officers' quarters over in the well? There they are, and they're still there, and they're still being used.
That was the Marine Barracks.
That was with the Marine Barracks, all right.
They're actually not still being used. That building is also condemned and is vacant now.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, they moved everybody out of there about 2 years ago.
Huh.
Used to be building 61, now
Right.
it's building 90.
That's what I mean.
I always learn something when I do this. I was at my dentist, and the lady, the receptionist, said to me, when I was telling her about the book, she said, "Well, you know that place is haunted." So I had to call the people in Portsmouth who gave the haunted tours. Yeah, that's what they said. And when I was walking around it, I looked in down here. I think this is the intake place, and it's creepy. And this is the Lura Reservation today. One of the things, the Lura Reservation had a lot of shrink-wrap boats over there, and the workmen were doing work. And this was really the only picture I could get where there was nothing else in the picture. What surprised me about what was happening at the prison today was the fact that it was so quiet. And I don't know what I expected. Having done all of this work, I figured all this commotion would still be there. Well, it wasn't. It was dead silent, and that absolutely impressed me, that this was, all of this stuff had happened, and I've been working on this for so long, and people are coming and going, and there are wars and this, and quiet. And this is the last slide. Before I go to Q&A, since you're going to ask me all of these questions, I will debunk some of the myths. The first one was, which is what I told you, that in fact a lot of people had escaped. I'm going to say, and how did I know this? I was reading the Commandant's report, and it was Thomas Mott Osborne, and Franklin Roosevelt had written a paper in support of, written an article in the New York Times in support of Thomas Mott Osborne. And in the article he said, in the prison, no more prisoners have escaped than in any other facility in the nation. And he meant escaped. And I thought, well, for heaven's sakes. And as I got reading, yeah, there's maybe a dozen, 15. They're really pretty exciting. Humphrey Bogart was not there. As far as I can figure out. Walt Disney was not there. I was going through, when I went down to Boston, you could go through the logbooks, and what they had, before we had all of these FERPA things, they had all the prisoners, all their numbers, and their social security numbers. So I'm looking through these lists and lists and lists and lists to see if there's any Disney in there, about the time when I thought he might have been. And I did find a Disney. So I stopped and I looked him up, and he wasn't the one. He might have been a relative, but he wasn't one. And I looked through these lists and looked through these lists and could not find him. It is not a toxic site. You might have heard that it is. There's a lot of asbestos in the prison, but it's not a toxic site. The prison was not modeled on Disneyland. Well, you knew that. Snare and trees.
The other way around, the prison was there first.
But yeah, but you know, people ask me that. You knew that The Last Detail, that movie, was set there. Well, supposedly it was set there. It wasn't there. It was a movie set, which was too bad. NAVFAC, what do I have that here for? Oh, Naval Facilities. People always ask me who owns this thing, you know, if they want to buy it, who do they go see? I think it's Naval Facilities, who when I first wrote the book, I called them, well, I called a lot of people and I said, I want to do this. And I called them in Rhode Island and asked permission, basically. And they didn't say I couldn't. They didn't say I could, so I just did. But what really allowed me to do this, and I owe NAVFAC, Naval Facilities, a big thank you. Just before I wrote this book, I was looking for some information that I didn't have. And they had done a whole big thing on historical preservation. And they had this big thing about the prison. It was really about the building of the prison and what it looked like, and they were trying to put it historically, but it really got, it was the missing piece that I needed. And so I went into the prison and asked if I could see it. And there's like 2 copies. And they said, yeah, you can see it, but you have to see it here. And I thought, you know, this is going to be 2090 by the time I finish this big long book. And then somebody said to me in the prison, you know, I think the Maine State Library might have one. So I called the Maine State Library and I said, I am looking for this publication. Do you have it? And the librarian, bless him, he said, yeah, we do. You want a disc? I said, yeah, here's my address. So he sent it to me. So I got it on my computer. Stuff like that happened a lot. And what else? I think I told you about the guards and that you didn't get shot if you were, I mean, you didn't have to serve the guards sentence if you let somebody out. All right, that's all I have to say. So what are your questions if you have any? Yeah.
A couple of times in your presentation, a little earlier on, you mentioned the phrase, the worst of the worst. Were you referring to the building or the prisoners?
Both. There were times when it was really nasty to be there, and I think its reputation in many instances is well deserved. But it was the facilities, it was the lack of this, it was the lack of that. It was that sometimes they were with it and sometimes they weren't. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah. It was not often a fun place to be, which is the point in many cases. What else? Yeah.
Were these all naval prisoners only?
No. Well, Navy. Marine Corps, Navy, and Coast Guard.
Okay.
It
No
was-
Army?
It was the Navy's answer to Leavenworth.
I heard that there was some Army when they had too many people and they had to bring in it, but yeah, it was, and that was that was a problem, and that was one of the reasons.
That wouldn't be prisoners. That was over at Fort Langdon. Everybody from Langdon was going back to duty.
Yes, correct.
Prisoners, we had murderers there. We had You name it, we had it. We had bad people there.
Yeah, they did, he's right, they did. What was I gonna say? Forgot, but that's okay. Yeah,
You were talking about the cement. I was told, we took a tour of that when I lived in Kitchener, and they said that the mixture of the cement wasn't really good and that was causing decay of the existing buildings. Did you read anything about that, or does anybody know anything about that? No?
I don't. One of the things that I read in the one of the newspaper accounts when they were building it was that they had used Conway granite. And that was also a myth, it was just scored concrete, but I hadn't heard that, that doesn't mean it wasn't, so.
The salt atmosphere probably doesn't do it.
Doesn't help either, right?
Right.
Yeah,
One of the stories goes back a ways before they became too expensive, that the prisoners were eating a lot of lobster. Is that true? No, you hear that a lot.
Guards didn't even do lobster.
I have heard that, I have heard that. I don't have any reason to think it's not true. But I didn't find any documented evidence of that, not that anybody would.
We had a wooden hull boat. It was called a torpedo retriever. And that was in case anybody tried to escape by water, which they did. And we'd let them try to swim across, and when they were drowning, we'd pick them up out of the water. They couldn't go near the water, so they didn't have lobster. We used to catch lobsters down at the boathouse, but that was for the guards.
Well, I assume that this would have been World War II, living back a ways, when this was happening.
Apparently it was.
Never heard it.
I see a hand somewhere. Yes?
What was the story about somebody had intended to buy that and refurbish it, and it never happened?
Correct. You probably know Sawtell.
So,
Yeah, he had done a lot of preservation work. The Wentworth Hotel, I think it was one of his projects, and something in Dover as well. And he had they'd signed the contract and they were busting things up in the annex when he died, and everything stopped, and nobody has picked it up since then. I know, it's too bad.
I've read in different articles a couple of times that they want to get rid of it, but because it's a military base and all the security involved and everything, it's really limited what any developer could do with the place. I mean, you couldn't turn it into a hotel and have everybody coming and going, and tourists, visitors, because it's a military base.
It's a nuclear
A
base.
nuclear base,
Yeah.
yeah. That's part of the problem. Somehow Sawtell had circumvented something, but that's part of the issue. That you don't want people traipsing through the shipyard to get to the prison. Yeah. When I was giving a talk at the Portsmouth Rotary, they had all kinds of plans for the prison. So I was sorry to dash their hopes.
Is it in any condition now that it could be
No.
rehabbed and used? No?
Probably not. It's been vacant and not taken care of. It's also in the historic register. And what I've been told is that it's too expensive to tear down and it's too expensive to keep up. And finding somebody who could do would be fabulously expensive, and somebody who could abide by all of the problems, all of the guidelines that they had is almost insurmountable.
There's been half a dozen buildings that the shipyard has offered up for the public outleasing program. And like you said, aside from the public not being allowed, you can't have any kind of business that the public general public can go to. Additionally, the last clause on there says, by the way, if the government wants this building back for any reason, we're taking it and your business is going home. So virtually no company can do that with any of the buildings down there. They've tried it 3 times.
I was stationed there twice, 59 through 61, and again in 64 through 66. And the only way that place could be maintained, we had Navy specialists, pipe fitters, electricians, plumbers, and there would be a half a dozen of those guys with prisoner crews of 20 and 30 prisoners. The prisoners were learning a trade, and they were maintaining the building and keeping that old structure, antiquated structure, operational.
Yeah, I had heard that. I think that's true.
I know it's true.
It's true. You've been a great, yes.
I heard this, wondering if it's true that during World War II that MPs would round up the unruly sailors in Portsmouth and take them there. Is that true, or did that never happen? Was it just long-term prisoners?
You know, when I was reading the Commandant's reports, they always put down who in the prison was, and they'd go to the cell block, and then they'd come back, and they were like soap operas, and you'd turn the pages and find out what happened to this guy. But in between there, the Marines guards were getting into trouble all the time. It was drunk and disorderly, it was just, and I kept thinking, but, you know, so I don't know what to tell you. Yeah, they did. They were, yeah.
You had to
they
be a
were-
court-martial prisoner to get there.
Well, that's also true, but they took care of their own when they came in some other state than they should have been. You've been a great audience. You probably missed your dinner and you're starving to death. Thank you very, very much for your kind attention.